President, I rise to revisit an issue today that some in this body, I'm sure, no doubt, would probably not want to revisit. And my intention is not to cause any of my colleagues discomfort, but this is an issue, and you, Madam President, know more than most, that needs to be discussed. And you've been doing a great job of discussing it. But I think it's become pretty clear to most Americans and many members of this body that this body made a mistake a few months back, a mistake with significant consequences for our security, for the security of the Middle East, and certainly a mistake as it relates to some of our own American citizens. The mistake that was made was for the first time in U.S. history on a national security agreement of major importance, the Congress of the United States moved forward to approve an agreement not on the basis of a bipartisan majority, which is the history of this country, but on the basis of a partisan minority in both houses. Of course, Madam President, I'm talking about President Obama's Iranian nuclear deal that will very soon, as early as next month, according to the terms of the agreement, be sending tens of billions of dollars to the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the world. So there are many things that are going on in this body right now, Madam President. We're looking at the spending bills. There's a lot of concern about terrorism. As a matter of fact, polling is showing that terrorism right now is ranking the highest issue for Americans, higher than even the economy, given the attacks in California, what's happening with ISIS. Amidst all of these challenges, however, the implementation of the Obama administration's nuclear deal with Iran is looming on the horizon and is not being talked about enough in this body. It is critical that we keep our eye on Iran, still the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, particularly now. Why is it so critical now? Because as I noted, as early as next month, in January, tens of billions of dollars of sanctions relief will be pouring into the country of Iran, according to the terms of the agreement. I'd like to commend my colleague from New Jersey, Senator Menendez. I was presiding last week in the Senate, and once again, he gave another outstanding speech on American foreign policy, on American national security, this time on what's going on with Iran. What's going on with their activities of stabilizing the Middle East. What's going on with their activities of violating, as we speak, UN Security Council resolutions. And yes, I know that we debated this issue for a long time on the Senate floor. And I'm sure that some of my colleagues who voted for this deal are done. They don't want to talk about it anymore. Well, Madam President, if you recall, one of the arguments to support this deal, one of the arguments that the President was making is that we were told that this deal would change Iran's behavior. President Obama stated, quote, "The deal demonstrates that if Iran complies with its international obligations, then it can fully rejoin the community of nations," unquote. The words of the text of the agreement even state that the United States, quote, is expressing its desire to build a new relationship with Iran. And of course, Secretary Kerry, in hearings and in private briefings with the Senate, noted that he thought, and you saw his actions, that the agreement would establish a much more positive and constructive relationship between Iran and the United States. So that was one of the arguments for the deal that we voted on. How's that working out? Well, I think we've gotten a new relationship with Iran, all right, but it's worse than the old one. Madam President, since the signing of the Iranian deal, Iran has taken deliberative steps, definitive steps that continue to undermine the security interests of the United States and our allies and those of our citizens. In almost every region, in almost every realm, every action the Iranians have taken have seemed to want to increase tension between us and Iran and some of our allies. Let me provide some examples. Almost as soon as the ink was dry on the signing of this agreement, the Iranian regime and its leaders continued what they typically do, chanting death to America, and more specifically, the Ayatollah Khamenei predicted, quote, that the Zionist regime, of course he's referring to Israel, will be nothing in 25 years. Another one of his references to wiping Israel off the map. After the agreement, then he stated, until then, until the 25-year period, struggling, heroic, and jihadi morale will leave no moment of serenity for the Zionists. That's the leader of the country we did this deal with, after we signed the agreement. So, still certainly provocative in that regard. How about their funding of Hezbollah, one of its terrorist proxies around the world? Still full speed ahead, estimates of up to $200 million a year. Well, that continues after the signing. How about abiding by UN Security Council resolutions like the one that prevents the Quds Force commander, General Soleimani, from traveling? Well, we know that was violated. As a matter of fact, Soleimani went to Moscow to meet with Putin to discuss arms transfers, likely in violation of the UN Security Council resolution that bans conventional weapons being imported to Iran. So that was another violation, and likely planning another one. Let me remind this body about the Quds Force commander. This is what former U.S. Army Chief of Staff General Ray Odierno said about him. Soleimani is the one who has been exporting malign activities throughout the Middle East for some time now. He's absolutely responsible for killing many Americans in Iraq. In fact, I would say the last 2 years I was there, the majority of our casualties came from Soleimani's surrogates. And this is the person who is negotiating with Putin to trade arms, likely in violation of another UN Security Council resolution. What about his troops? Well, we've seen an increase of Iranian troops in Syria. General Dunford, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, estimated that there's probably about 2,000 Iranian troops in Syria helping to lead the fight to save Assad and working with the Russians to do that. Now, how about Iran's compliance with UN Security Council Resolution 1929, which bans its ballistic missile program? Remember that issue? We debated that issue on the floor. General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, under no circumstances should we agree to lifting that ban. But we did in the deal. And now we're learning that Iran has tested not one, but 2 ballistic missiles on October 11th and November 21st, in likely, almost certain violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1929. In my view, that's a violation of the Iran agreement. Here's what our ambassador to the UN stated about this. She said that the missiles that Iran tested only months after we passed the agreement are, quote, inherently capable of delivering a nuclear weapon. So they're testing nukes. They're testing missiles with that capability. Madam President, this should concern all Americans. And what should really concern all Americans is right now it appears the Obama administration, despite Ambassador Power's statement, the Obama administration is looking to do nothing on this violation of the UN Security Council resolution. Here's how my colleague from Tennessee, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker, put it. Quote, Iran violates UN Security Council resolutions because it knows neither this administration nor the UN Security Council is likely to take any action. Instead, the administration remains paralyzed and responds to Iran's violations with empty words of condemnation and concern. As I mentioned last week, my colleague from New Jersey, Senator Menendez, gave an outstanding speech on December 8th talking all about this issue. And he noted that, similar to Senator Corker, that the Obama administration's reaction has been muted, almost one of silence. And Madam President, there's more. A report from the International Atomic Energy Agency, which we are all anticipating, just recently came out, stated that Iran pursued nuclear weapons in secret until 2009, longer than previously believed. So the country that we're doing this deal with, at least according to the IAEA, has been lying to the world. So, Iran's been caught lying and cheating. It's testing ballistic missiles against the UN Security Council resolutions 1929 and others. It's still funding global terrorism. It's sending thousands of troops to Syria to prop up Assad. It has sent the man with the blood of thousands of American soldiers on his hands to Russia to talk about arms trading and likely further violation of UN Security Council resolutions. And of course, it's still chanting death to America and talking about wiping Israel off the face of the earth. All since the Obama administration signed the Iranian nuclear agreement. But Madam President, there's one more outrage, perhaps the worst one in my view. In a direct affront to the United States and our citizens, Iran is still holding 5 Americans against their will in that country. Think about that. Now, many of us who closely watched the negotiations thought surely, Secretary Kerry, who had enormous leverage, the entire world was aligned against Iran, would surely use that leverage to get our citizens free. Or maybe, if he wasn't going to do it as part of the deal, some kind of side agreement after the signing that they'd be quietly released. But like everything else, since the signing of this agreement, the American hostage situation in Iran has actually gotten worse. Madam President, I'd like to read the names and describe a little bit about the Americans who are currently being held in Iran. Amir Hekmati of Michigan, a United States Marine, detained in Iran in 2011 while visiting Iranian relatives and sentenced to 10 years in prison for espionage. A U.S. Marine who proudly served his country. I'm a Marine. We don't leave our fellow Marines on the battlefield. But evidently, the Obama administration has not learned that lesson. Saeed Abedini of Idaho, a Christian pastor who was detained in Iran in 2012 and sentenced to 8 years in prison on charges related to his religious beliefs. Again, an American languishing in Iranian jail right now. A pastor, Robert Levinson of Florida, a former official of the FBI who disappeared in 2007. Iran's leaders deny knowledge of Levinson's whereabouts or any involvement in his disappearance. And most recently, Simak Namazi, a Dubai-based businessman, was arrested after the signing of this Iranian nuclear deal. After the signing, was arrested by the Iranian government while visiting relatives in Iran. Right now, any charges against him are unknown. That happened on October 15th. And of course, Jason Rezaian of California, a journalist for the Washington Post, who was credentialed as a journalist by the government of Iran, has been detained for over 500 days. And recently, again, after the signing of the agreement with President Obama, was sentenced to an undisclosed prison for an undisclosed term for espionage. 5 Americans, right now. Madam President, I don't have to remind my colleagues, it's the holiday season. It's a time for families and loved ones to come together, to be with each other. But what about the families of these Americans? Who's thinking about them? Secretary Kerry and President Obama should be on the phone every day working for their release. But that's clearly not happening. As the Washington Post editorial board put it recently, quote, Iran appears content to allow Mr. Rezaian and the other Americans to rot in prison indefinitely, even as the regime collects more than $100 billion in sanctions relief and is granted the role it has long sought as a regional power. That should not be an acceptable outcome, unquote. That's the Washington Post. That's the Washington Post editorial board. This should not be an acceptable outcome. No, it shouldn't. It should not be. Madam President, all of this begs some very obvious questions. Given Iran's consistent, provocative actions against U.S. interests and our citizens since the signing of the Iran deal, and given one of the promises of the deal, better relations with Iran, more constructive behavior from Iran, has proven to be utterly false, why in the world are we moving full steam ahead with the lifting of sanctions as early as next month? Think about that. Why indeed are we getting ready to release tens of billions of dollars to the world's biggest sponsor of state terrorism when we know that the additional money will only embolden Iran? Just think how they're acting now when they have tens of billions of dollars to further their terrorist activities, and will embolden them to act in even more nefarious ways against our interests, those of our allies, and most importantly, those of American citizens. Another question, why aren't the President and Secretary Kerry at a minimum telling the Iranians that they won't see one dime of the billions and billions of dollars we're set to hand over to the Iranians until all 5 Americans are released from prison? Why aren't we using that leverage? That leverage is going to go away as soon as we release that money. And why are we getting ready to release tens of billions of dollars to Iran when it is clear that they are going to simply violate this agreement? Now, that's not just my view, Madam President. Former Senator and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was quoted as saying just last week, it's not if, but when Iran will violate President Obama's nuclear agreement. Just last week, she stated, quote, they are going to violate it. Former Senator, former Secretary of State, knows a little bit about the issue. She helped negotiate it. They are going to violate it, she said. They're going to be provocative about it. And we need to respond quickly and very harshly, unquote. That's the former Secretary of State. Well, I agree with the former Secretary of State. The Iranians are going to violate this agreement. In fact, it's very likely the Iranians have already violated this agreement with their UN Security Council resolution violations. So what should we do? First, for any Americans listening, watching, who care about this issue, I urge you, call the President. Call the Secretary of State, call the White House, call the State Department. Tell them something that I would believe that the vast, vast majority of Americans agree with. That our government should not be relieving Iran of any sanctions while it continues to illegally hold 5 Americans hostage. We should demand our president that he should not allow tens of billions of dollars to flood into the biggest terrorist regime in the world while our citizens languish in Iranian jails. This is simple, and it's just wrong. So we need to light up the switchboard. Let President Obama know. Here's the number to the White House switchboard, 202-456-1414. Call the president. Tell him you think it's fundamentally wrong to let 5 Americans languish in prison while we're getting ready to send the biggest terrorist regime in the world tens of billions of dollars. Call John Kerry. Here's the number to the State Department switchboard, 202-647-4000. Tell him, Mr. Secretary, get on the phone. Release these prisoners. Release our citizens, or don't give Iran any of the billions of dollars that they think they're going to get next month. Second, I agree with my colleague, Senator Menendez, when he gave his speech last week that we need to keep the leverage against Iran by tightening the full range of sanctions available to us to penalize Iran for violating UN Security Council resolutions, as they have done within the last month. In his speech, he also said we need to reauthorize the Iran Sanctions Act. And I agree with him. This body should take action to do just that. And finally, I'm working to get support for a simple bill that would prevent the president from lifting sanctions until Iran is no longer designated a state sponsor of terrorism, and until Iran releases our 5 citizens who are languishing in their jails. Mr. President, with all due respect to my colleagues who voted for this agreement, I believe that this body made an enormous mistake by allowing the president's nuclear agreement to move forward. And Iran's actions since the signing of this agreement, day after day, against the interests of the United States and our citizens, has made this 100% clear. But this mistake can be undone. We don't have to allow Iran access to tens of billions of dollars in sanctions relief while they continue to destabilize the Middle East, while they continue their robust expansive terrorist activities throughout the world, and we certainly, and this is a message for the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, we certainly don't have to allow them the tens of billions of dollars while Iran retains and detains Americans on trumped-up charges in Iranian jails with no prospect for release. As the Washington Post put it, quote, "This should not be an acceptable outcome." Mr. President, I yield the floor.